you.
Thanks, Ali, and thanks to all of you for inviting me. Well done for getting this webinar series set up. Ali is actually kindly going to share screen and we'll have my presentation open. So I'll just wait for that to pop up. Excellent. There we go. Okay. And hopefully I'm just going to do a bit of a signal with my hand so I don't have to keep saying, next slide to Ali. But hopefully that'll all go smoothly, but do bear with us. So I'm going to start by talking through some of the history of trade unionism in Britain by focusing on some of the kind of key battles that unions have fought over the period of time, some of which I'm sure many of you will already be familiar with. And then I'll talk about the relationship between the Labour Party and the unions today. Now, obviously, the history of the trade union and labour movement is, the greatest democratic force in this country, has been for hundreds of years. It isn't something that gets taught in schools, so it's something that we, as working class people, have to learn ourselves. And I am no historian. Everything I know is from comrades in the movement who've taught me, and I'm still learning all the time. I'm not offering anything comprehensive, but I'm hoping to spark some interest and get some conversations going. And I think it's important that we don't take for granted that everyone, I usually say in the room, but in the Zoom, or everyone we meet at a Labour or union meeting knows everything, or indeed knows anything. Some of them don't know much. But everyone here will have different experiences. While some of you have maybe been politically active or involved for decades, some of you will be newer to the movement. Perhaps some of you are trade union reps. Maybe some of you aren't a member of a trade union at all yet. But I'd be interested to know, so please feel free to introduce yourself in the comments. Let us know if you're a trade union member or rep or activist or anything. It'd be nice to see where everyone's coming from. Ali gave you a bit about my background. I work for the TUC. I used to work for Unite. I'm also the trade union liaison officer in my constituency Labour Party, and I'm going to talk a bit more about that kind of work later on. But first of all, I'm going to take us into a time machine and work our way forward. So next slide, please. So trade unionism in Britain, in its fundamental sense of working people coming together for a common cause to improve their working lives, can be traced back to much earlier than this timeline, actually, which is from the TUC's history website. In fact, some of the Unite the Union's predecessors, the unions that kind of merged to form what we now know of as Unite, can trace themselves back to guilds in medieval times. But trade unionism, as we understand it today, it really took off during the Industrial Revolution. First, as workers started to organise, it was outlawed, and then trade unionism was then legalised in 1824. Great. So one of the events which is seen as significant in bringing about trade unionism was Tolpuddle. And in 1834, 6 men from Tolpuddle, which is a village in Dorset in South England, they were sentenced for forming a union, or rather they were accused of swearing a secret oath, which was illegal at the time. As I mentioned before, trade unionism itself became legal 10 years previously. So these were trumped up allegations used to stop them from campaigning for agricultural wages, fair agricultural wages. They were sentenced and they were transported to Australia, as was the done thing at the time. And the image that you can see was printed in 1838, and it shows the portraits of 5 of these 6 Tolpuddle men who'd recently returned to England and hailed as martyrs. And every year now, thousands of people still descend on the village of Tolpuddle for a weekend of festivities to remember them and to celebrate trade unionism. This year it took place over Zoom, but I do recommend going in future years. In 1834, the Derby Silk Mill strikes. This is in the same year, a significant strike at the Derby Silk Mill. 8,000 walked out after one worker was issued with a fine over so-called faulty work and then dismissed. Many of those working in the mill at the time were children, and the protest became a general strike right across the town, and it is another significant moment credited with kind of kick-starting the trade union movement. 1837, the Chartists. So workers put forward a new set of 6 demands known as the Charter, and the supporters of it became known as the Chartists. And their demands were, number 1, universal manhood suffrage, so for every man a vote, every man, not every woman. Number 2, annual parliament, so elections taking place every year to elect MPs. Number 3, secret ballots. Number 4, wages for MPs. At the time, they didn't get paid, so it was basically just rich people who were becoming MPs. Number 5, abolition of the property qualification for voting, so you didn't have to be property owning to get a vote. And number 6, equal electoral constituencies, so constituencies having roughly the same number of people per constituency, so no more what are called rotten boroughs. Now, 5 out of those 6 demands are now the law. The one that isn't is the annual parliaments, which I'm kind of glad we don't have a general election every year. 6 million signatures were collected in a massive petition, which was quite an extraordinary feat at the time, considering very few people were literate. And in Newport in South Wales, there was even an armed uprising in support of the Charter. And the first ever general strike in support of it took place in 1842. So the campaign really forced the pace of democratic reform. And later in 1848, there was the Chartist demonstration. Next slide. Crowds marched with their banners from various points in London to a huge demonstration organised by the National Charter Association. It took place on Kennington Common. Now, 1848 is a significant year because revolutions took place all across Europe, but not here. And it's disputed as to why that's the case. Next slide. 1868, the first TUC Congress was held. Engineers, miners and agricultural labourers began coming together to form new national and regional trade associations and organisations which spanned different workplaces of different sectors for the first time. And the Trades Union Congress, a national forum for coordinating trade union demands, was founded in Manchester in June of 1868. The 1871 Trade Union Act then established the legal status of trade unions, although other legislation made it quite difficult for unions to organise picketing and strikes. Next slide. 1888, the matchwomen's strike. For 3 weeks, workers went on strike at a London matchstick factory over pay, fines, health and safety and other issues. And they won almost all of their demands. And it's considered quite a significant moment in history because it was a strike exclusively of women, and in fact, many of them being teenage girls. 1871. So I've done these in the wrong order. Apologies for the little error here. The first Durham Miners Gala took place. Now, the gala is also known as the Big Meeting. It is the largest trade union event in Europe. It still is today, a celebration of trade unionism, particularly the mining union tradition. At its peak, the gala attracted more than 300,000 people, more than 7 times the population of Durham itself. And it's a rich tradition in the labour movement calendar, a celebration of trade unionism, something that's been happening, as you can see, for over 130 years. It started out as really a positive coming together, and over the years has been an important way for mining communities and historic mining communities of maintaining their strength and pride in the face of what has been obviously horrendous adversity and attacks. Traditionally, miners and their communities carry their village banners from mining villages from very early in the morning, like 5 a.m. sometimes, into Durham city centre, into the big rally. I definitely recommend going again. It couldn't take place this year, but it's an amazing event if you ever get the chance to go. Now, fast forward to the 20th century, 1900, the founding of the Labour Party. Now, in 1899, a member of the Amalgamated Society of Railway Servants in Doncaster, a guy by the name of Thomas Steeles, proposed to his union branch meeting that the TUC call a special conference to bring together all the left-wing organisations and form them into a single body that could sponsor parliamentary candidates. Now, this motion went from his union branch through to all stages of the TUC. And the proposed conference was indeed held in 1900, and the meeting was attended by a broad spectrum of working class and left-wing organisations, and it founded the Labour Representation Committee, which is now known as the modern-day Labour Party in Britain. So I like to think for that is a little lesson. Don't think that the motions you take to your union branch meeting or your Labour Party branch meeting are meaningless. You know, that one in particular founded our great party. In 1914, the Burston Strike School, it was founded as a consequence of a school strike, and it became the centre of the longest running strike in British history. It lasted from 1914 to 1939 in the little village of Burston in Norfolk in the east of England. And today the building stands as a museum to the strike. It began when teachers at the village school, a teacher and her husband, were sacked after a dispute with the area school management committee. and the school children went on strike in their support. And every year, similarly to Tolpuddle, every year hundreds of people turn up for a rally to commemorate that 25-year-long strike. Now, 1918, there's a war going on, and thousands of women who, while the men were fighting a war, were redeployed into frontline services, working on trains, buses and tubes during the war, went on strike because they weren't being paid what the men were previously being paid to do in those jobs. This photo shows some women tram conductors in the same year, not necessarily on strike at the time, but an early fight for equal pay. 1926, the general strike. Now, what a general strike, for those who don't know, means is that the strike includes workers in all or at least most sectors of the economy. That could either be over a shared issue, for example, everyone fighting for a pay rise, or it could be a solidarity strike, as this one was, over a reduction in pay and worsening of conditions for miners. The general strike was called by the TUC, and it began on the 4th of May 1926 with 1.7 million workers throughout the country striking in solidarity. Now, after an initial standstill, scabs were recruited and the army was brought in to keep certain industries running, for example, in transport. So after 9 days on strike, the TUC admitted defeat. It did, however, strengthen the feeling of solidarity and antagonism towards the ruling class and the government. And in 1929, in the general election that year, the Labour Party won more seats than any other party in Parliament for the first time in its history. Next one. 1927, so no surprises that what followed the general strike was anti-union legislation. The trade disputes and the Trade Union Act of 1927 banned trade unions in the civil service from belonging to the TUC, and union members also had to opt in to pay the political levy. So that meant that they had to actively choose whether some of the union subs that they paid went to the Labour Party, whereas before it was automatic, and that led to the Labour Party losing 18% of its income. Also, general strikes and other sympathetic action were forbidden, and there were restrictions on picketing introduced. The Act remained in place until 1946, after the Attlee government was elected the year before. 1933, this isn't a strike, but I think it's an important moment to remember in the labour movement's history in showing kind of international solidarity. So 6 years prior to the Second World War, the National Joint Council, which comprised of the TUC and the Labour Party, called for a boycott of buying German goods and services as a protest against fascism in Germany. The chair of the Labour Party at the time produced a pamphlet called Down with Fascism as part of the TUC and Labour Party's campaign to expose the activities of the Nazi dictatorship. 16,000 copies of that pamphlet were sold in the first 4 months after publication. The same year, 1933, Unemployed Workers' March. Now, in the same year, the TUC and Labour Party again organised a massive demonstration on the 5th of February that year for unemployed workers. The march and rally was attended by 300,000 people, while demonstrations were held in 23 other cities in Britain on the same day. Unemployment had reached 22% that year, the highest it has ever been. Fast forwarding a bit now to the founding of the NHS, that Labour government that I just mentioned is now in power, its leader being Attlee, and the size of the Labour majority in the 1945 election, 146 seats, gave it a real mandate for the first time to carry out its election manifesto, Let Us Face the Future. 6 of the 20 members of that Labour cabinet were union sponsored. Now, Labour quickly invested on an unprecedented scale in jobs, homes, and of course creating the National Health Service. Other quickly passed legislation covered 3 main areas around nationalisation and economic planning, social welfare, and of course pro-trade union legislation. The Ford strike in Dagenham and Liverpool, again fast forwarding a bit here, so just over 50 years ago, the Ford strikes in Dagenham and Liverpool, they're considered one of the most pivotal industrial actions by women workers in UK Labour history. Now, sewing machinists working for the Ford Motor Company in the Transport and General Workers Union, which later merged to form Unite, walked out in a dispute over pay grades, beginning a strike that is credited with paving the way for the Equal Pay Act of 1970, which outlawed pay discrimination between men and women, at least in theory. The women who they made the upholstery in Ford Motors were demanding an upgrading of their technical work as sewing machinists. Years later, the Ford women later won their demand of being regraded into a technical skill grade. But it wasn't until 1984 that they won that, after a further 6-week-long strike. 1972, the miners went on strike for the first time since the general strike in a demand for better pay, which they won. 24 million working days were lost during this strike, and the same happened again in 1974, which contributed to the fall of the Conservative government. Again, 1972, the first ever national building workers' strike took place this year. It was a time when building sites were so unsafe that one building worker died every day. Now, after 12 weeks, they won a significant pay rise. But 5 months later, a bunch of strikers were suddenly arrested on charges including conspiracy to intimidate. And in 1973, 6 of them in Shrewsbury were found guilty and sent to prison. One of them, which is the gentleman pictured in the middle of this photo, was Ricky Tomlinson, who later went on to become a famous actor. You might recall him in the royal family. Now, in Willesden, North London, a 2-year strike took place in a battle for union recognition at a film processing lab. The strike the strike led to the state trying to crack down massively. More than 500 people were arrested during the strike, and it was the first time that the Metropolitan Police's paramilitary division was deployed for an industrial activity. The strikers were overwhelmingly migrant Asian women, and it was the first of its kind to pull in support from across the union movement. Now, again, this isn't a strike. It's more kind of a general campaign by the Labour movement. Now, after the first few years of Thatcher's premiership, the unemployment rate hovered between 7 and 8% from the summer of 1980 through to 81, when it began to rise very, very quickly. And by March 1982, unemployment reached 9% and later reached as high as 13%. And to this day, it's the highest unemployment rate since the Depression. I wonder how coronavirus and the aftermath of the jobs retention scheme being pulled away might affect that. But nonetheless, I love this photo. I don't know if you can see here, but there's a couple of famous people pictured, one of them being John McDonnell in the rather fetching trench coat. And that's outside the Greater London Council, where the Mayor, Ken Livingstone, has unleashed a banner, the building facing Parliament, so kind of really trying to show up Thatcher, a big banner showing the number of people that were unemployed in London at the time. Next one. Of course, the miners' strike. Thatcher's plan to close the coal pits resulted in a year-long strike by the National Union of Mine Workers, and more than 123,000 miners were involved in it. It's thought to have been the most bitter dispute in British industrial history, and while it resulted in violent clashes with police, a huge campaign of demonisation by the state, and ultimately defeat, it was also an incredible showing of the dignity of working class solidarity and the struggle for decency. The communities affected by the strike sacrificed everything in their fight, going almost a year living without work. In his book on the strike, Seamus Milne said that the strike has no real parallel in size, duration, and impact anywhere in the world. It feels wrong to kind of give it a 1-minute spiel, but moving on. Now, the ambulance strikes of 89-90, this was a dispute over pay, which was ultimately a successful victory in the face of Thatcher's government. The ambulance strikers saw a huge amount of support from the public, and I can see some parallels with this actually, with the current dispute going on at the moment, where nurses are not getting the same pay rise as other sections of the public sector that's gathering pace. Fast forward now, and New Labour is in government, and this is really what it says on the tin. After years of trade unions arguing for a minimum wage, it got introduced in 1999. And in 2002, it wasn't all rose-tinted glasses for the New Labour government. Firefighters were demanding a 39% pay increase to bring their salary up to just £30,000. It was the first nationwide firefighter strike in the UK since the 70s, and The dispute created a lot of hostility between the FBU and the then Labour government, and it ultimately led to the union disaffiliating from the Labour Party in 2004. Now, 2011, public sector strike. This was the most recent strike involving such a significant section of the workforce taking action all together at the same time. 2 million public sector workers all walked out on the same day in November 2011 over pensions. 20,000 schools were closed, 6,000 medical operations were reportedly cancelled, and more than a quarter of the civil service walked out. And that brings us up to the last 5 years. More recently, and these are just a few of the strikes that I've found particularly inspiring: the junior doctor strike, the fast food strike, British Airways cabin crew, which was the longest running strike in aviation history, and the Birmingham bin strike. Just a few out of like a number that have taken place over that time. And of course, in that time as well, we've also had the 2016 Trade Union Act, which further limits trade unions' power. This graph just shows you a little bit of what strike activity over a long period of time has looked like. Now, this is actually measuring the days, the working days that have been lost to strike action. You can see there's a big surge there when the general strike happened, a few surges there when the miners' strikes in particular in the 70s and 80s happened, but over the last few decades, the number of days lost to strike action has been very, very low indeed. Next one. So how about today? The Labour Party, what does it look like now? Well, it's got 12 affiliated trade unions. The Labour Party is unique, let's just to say that, because the link with our party and the trade union movement provides a direct link to thousands of workplaces across the country, and trade unions collectively bring 4 million working people together, the ones that are affiliated to the Labour Party at least, through that affiliation. In which trade unions are represented within the party and are able to influence things happens at a local, regional and national level. And there's an umbrella organisation, Labour Unions, or as it's formerly kind of known as TULO, Trade Union Labour Organisation, which works to support that link and acts as a kind of conduit between the party and the unions on a sort of administrative matters, and runs collective campaigns, for example, around encouraging trade union membership amongst Labour Party members. Nationally, the unions collectively have seats on Labour's National Executive Committee and send delegations to its annual conference. And a very similar structure operates at a regional level as well, where unions have guaranteed spots on regional executives and send delegations to regional conferences. And then at a very local level, individual trade union branches can affiliate to CLP. So that's your kind of workplace branch, or it might be like a more regional branch that you're in. You can affiliate that to your local party. And this allows branches to have a vote at CLP meetings, and it allows them to send a delegate to CLP general committees. I always get confused with it's council or committees. CLPs often also elect a TULO officer, which I mentioned at the beginning, a trade union liaison officer, whose role can help coordinate activity between affiliated branches, and also kind of act as a bit of a solidarity tool really between constituency Labour parties and the wider union movement in your area. An interesting fact actually that because Labour Party is the party of trade unions and working people, everyone who stands to represent the Labour Party in public office, whether that's as a councillor or a mayor or a member of parliament, has to be a member of a trade union within the rule book. I'm not sure it's enforced enough, but it is a rule. So how does that then work in practice? How do unions influence the party? They sit on these committees, but what does that mean? Well, I guess I've kind of identified 4 ways really in which I see the unions mainly using to kind of get influence in the party. And the first is obviously through influencing policy, whether that's through going to conferences and sponsoring motions, or submitting things to Labour Party's policy forums, and of course influencing the manifesto. And the level of which unions have influence in policy shaping really, I think, depends on the leadership. Under Jeremy Corbyn, unions had a lot of influence in shaping what the 2017 general election manifesto looked like, for example. That hasn't been the case under previous leadership. So some of these things depend on the nature of the party at the time. Campaigning as well. unions campaign to change Labour Party policy, whether it's in government or it isn't, but unions can also campaign to support Labour Party policy. So, for example, when we're out of government, unions can run campaigns around bringing up the minimum wage to the living wage, things that help make the case for Labour Party demands within the workplace. Resources, so things like funding. Labour Party's biggest funders are the unions. Staffing, lending office space is a crucial thing that unions do at the time of elections. And then candidates, unions sponsor their members to become candidates, running from council to right up to the leader of the Labour Party. And they do this through running training for their members, trying to encourage them to consider running for Parliament or running for various levels of office. And there are a number of, particularly the fresher new intake of MPs that we can name that have kind of come through their trade union. One example would be Zara Sultana, who I think would say that she wouldn't be in Parliament now were it not for the support of her trade union. So they're just some of the ways that unions are able to influence the Labour Party. Final slide. So now I kind of want to hear from you guys, I guess, if there are any questions or more. I'm interested in what your thoughts are about what happens next. We're obviously at a key moment in the Labour Party where we're under new leadership. What is that going to look like for the future of the Labour trade union relationship, and what does the future of the Labour movement in the country look like, particularly as, again, we're at a crucial moment where workplace issues under the coronavirus pandemic, there's a massive focus on them. People are talking about a new normal, and we need to make sure that trade unions are really part of that conversation in shaping what the new normal looks like at the end of this crisis. So I'm keen to kind of get some ideas and some thoughts from you guys, and I hope some of that information was useful and informative. Thanks again for having me.
Amazing. Thank you, Shelly. So like I said at the beginning, if anyone has any specific questions, stick them in the chat here. So if you're live in the Zoom call, stick them in the chat here. And if you are on the website, stick them on the chat there, and I'll try and have a look at both. We have 3 questions in already, so throughout the duration, and I'll ask them individually, Shelly, because I always find when you ask 3 questions at once, one always gets lost, and then I get an email afterwards saying, why did my question get lost?
Okay.
So the first question is very relevant to LMN, and it's a question I've heard before. And so the question is, I'm a member of a local party and a member of my trade union, but I find that it is often missing BAME voices. How do we get more BAME voices involved in trade unions? It's not really a Labour trade union question, but any expertise you can give on how people can get more involved, or what trade unions can do to connect specifically with BAME voices. It is getting better. Like in my local branch, there are definitely a lot more BAME voices now than there were when I first joined maybe 4 years ago. So any thoughts on, even if it's things that LMN can do more?
That's interesting, actually. I mean, I don't know whether encouraging more of your members to get involved in trade unions, I imagine it probably is something you're interested in, given that you've asked me to do this presentation today. But there is absolutely, a responsibility of the trade union movement to do some of that work, and I think it's partly about the union structures. For a long time, unions have been very white dominated in their structures, and I think representation is a key thing. But I think it's also about the kind of issues that unions tend to focus on, the kind of workplaces they tend to organise in, and I think particularly where there's like anti-racist struggles, not just in the wider community, but in workplaces, and the recognition that a lot of the issues that trade unions campaign around, whether it's pay, terms and conditions, health and safety, the current crisis has shone a big light on this. The way that BAME Muslim workers are disproportionately affected by a long way. You only have to look at the death toll of the impact of coronavirus on the high risk workplaces, frontline workers, to see that is the case. That aspect of the oppression of working class people is not highlighted enough by the unions. I don't think it's not a case that it's not being highlighted, it's not recognized enough. And I think that's one way to go in terms of like letting people know that trade unions are relevant to them, relevant because they recognize the specific and disproportionate ways that workplace issues affect them. So I would say, yeah, big responsibility on the trade union movement, but also as Labour members as well, we've got a responsibility to try and bring people in.
Yeah, and definitely, I think there's more that we can do. I mean, there was it wasn't by accident that we chose the first of our webinar series to include trade unionism, because our team kind of spoke to most of the big trade unions, and this was an issue that they were quite passionate in. So if anyone in the chat has any ideas and wants to get more involved in this area, do let us know, and we can help and support. I've got quite a few questions now, actually. So I'll start with this one. With real wages stagnating for everyday workers and rising exponentially for those at the top, and union memberships declining, how do we reach all those others outside of the movement, outside the party proper, as to the importance of unionizing and the collective fight for workers' rights? In short, action-wise, what can we do?
Gosh, I mean, I have to say, like, I am not an expert in organizing. I work in health and safety, right? That's my bag at the moment. And previously did like Labour Party stuff. What action can we take to get more people joining unions, but not just joining unions, getting active? One big thing for me is that, like, where unions are already taking action, I think it's not talked about enough in the Labour Party. It's not talked about enough generally. The media has an explicit agenda to like not talk about victories in the workplace. But even in the Labour Party, I don't think we shine a light on things enough. And I think were we to do that more, people would see the benefit of joining a union. But currently, particularly with young people, there's a real issue where people aren't aware of what unions are about, what they do, and how they're relevant to them. I don't know if I've gone off course with the question here.
No, I think I think that's good. I think a lot of times, I've had a lot of comments of it just feels like we're losing all the time, and we're not, because on local levels, unions are winning and branches are winning all the time. I'm a councillor at Heathrow. I know how often we have to fight Heathrow and different things. And specifically, there's a big campaign on British Airways going on right now, which you all know. People are winning all the time. So I guess my advice on that particular one would be just start small. We don't have to start on big national campaigns. There'll be loads of local stuff going on in branches that we can get tucked into. But I think you're right. The Labour Party could do a lot more in highlighting some of the big wins. I mean, in your presentation, you spoke about the junior doctors, the McDonald's strikes, the TGI Friday strikes, which was really inspiring. Some of the stuff that's going on around Uber and drivers, like there's a lot of wins going on that I think people can get involved in. I'll go straight to the next question so we can get through most of them in the next 10-15 minutes. So this one's from a councillor. We launched the Muslim Council Network that's slowly growing, and the number of Muslim councillors around the country. So this one came in through the website from a Muslim councillor who's asking what they can do as a councillor to better support trade unions locally and nationally, because often they don't hear anything about what they can do in their role as councillors to support the trade union movement. So,
well, you're a councillor. Have you got examples of things that you've been doing?
Yeah, I mean, look, like I said, Heathrow is, I'm a councillor at Heathrow, so there's always things, going on. Most often it's about, it can be, like you said, it's not dissimilar to what trade unions do nationally. So providing resources, providing gateways to authorities like leaders of the council, cabinet members and things like that. Sometimes I think it's about providing platforms for people to be able to organize. I'll give you a very good example. We've got this isn't to do with workplace stuff, but we've got a Black Lives Matter movement stuff that's going on locally, because our Tory councillors voted against Black History Month and the Black Lives Matter motion. And some of the stuff the Labour group is doing is attending their protests to make sure they're not kicked off of council property, because the council is much less likely to kick people off property if there are councillors there. providing them with resource information that they might need on what's going on. So I always think going to your branch meetings are the first most important thing any councillor can do. It's not just branch meetings within the Labour Party or branch meetings, your CLP meetings, but there are also trade union regional meetings that are happening all the time, and branch meetings, which no doubt you'll get invited to. So I'd say attending those. Anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think just to remember that as a councillor, you're also an employer, right? The council employs thousands of public sector workers. So I would say that one of the most important things that councillors should do should be to, you know, regardless of whether you're like a cabinet member or anything like that, you know, even as a backbencher, go and meet with the unions that are in your council and find out what the issues are that they may have, you know, from like the lunchtime assistants in schools to the bin collectors. There are always so many issues, particularly with the outsourced workers, that they would be really, really grateful to get your ear on. And I know so often, like, you know, even Labour councillors don't do that basic stuff of the work. So definitely meet with your own council's union reps and start a conversation. And then things like, you know, putting motions to your Labour group or to your council that are like relevant to the trade union issues, whether that's things that are going on nationally around supporting the pay demands, or it might be something that's happening more locally in your local authority area. And then when there are strikes happening in your local authority area, go and join the picket lines. Like, I know it sounds like a very small thing, but it will mean a lot to the people that are involved in that dispute. You know, councillors are kind of like local celebrities, and people on strike, it just gives them like a real boost, and it gives them a feeling of like a validation that somebody from the council has come and supported their strike. I mean, even if you're not a councillor, you should like do those things, and you should ask your councillors to be doing those things. But yeah, just some ideas. And you should be a member of a union if you're not as well, and join the councillors network of that union, as well as obviously the LMN councillors network.
Yeah, funnily enough, you say that we've had, I guess it's an indication on where the party is, not just now. I don't want to say specifically now, but where it has been in recent decades, where there is a lot of surprise in the chat box about how you have to be a member of a union to be a Labour Party candidate. A lot of people are very, very surprised.
Oh, really?
That,
You
yeah.
the chat box to me.
Yes, I can try and send you the link to the
Oh
web.
no, it's fine. I'm just looking at the Zoom and I'm like, no one's saying anything.
No, it's because I've set the privacy network so only the host gets all the questions, so I can ask people. So people,
Okay.
people can ask questions privately without having to expose themselves.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think it is something that people don't know is a thing, and I've definitely seen people get elected who are not members of a union. I think it's just a case of it's not enforced, but I know that some of the unions are trying to get the party to enforce it, and you know, it's not a lot to ask that people are a member of a union, especially if you know you're not in any kind of employment. You can still join Unite Community for a very low
Yeah,
amount.
definitely. All right. We've
What
got.
you were saying about the kind of more recent strikes, I'd be interested to know if anyone's got any suggestions. You know, thinking about if I was to do that lecture of like going through history, what are the ones within the last few years that should be on that timeline? Or if there are any even from going back even further that I maybe missed off that people think should be on there. I'd be interested to know.
Yeah, someone's just commented the Uber ones, so I guess that one's someone close to the heart. And we've also got another comment from the original question on trade unions, the doctor strike, which has been set. Okay, we've got someone said sharing best practice between what we are doing as councillors and other activists at local level could be really beneficial for others to apply in their areas. We've got a very interesting question that I think applies to some of the work you're doing very, very directly. Again, not specifically Labour Party or LMN related, but it's around COVID and how you think COVID is going to impact trade union membership and action at a local level.
It's a really good question, because I mean, the recent union membership figures that came out last month, I think it was, show that 91,000 people have joined a trade union within the last 12 months. And that isn't really even factoring in the kind of the months of the pandemic where I think it would have gone up even more. So I think a lot of people are joining a union because they're scared. And that is the main reason people join a union, was when something bad is happening in their workplace. You know, they're scared about their health, they're scared about their family's health, and they're scared about what kind of conditions they're having to work in. But as many more people are going to be facing redundancy, you know, companies right across the economy are announcing redundancies. As I said before, who knows what's going to happen with as the jobs retention scheme is phased out. We're also looking at a lot of unionized industries losing a lot of workers, and therefore unions losing a lot of members. So I think it's going to be a really mixed picture. And I think that there's a real task for us as socialists to pick up on where people are joining unions and to insert some politics, and to make sure that people aren't just joining a union, but they're joining an active union, they're becoming activists, they're becoming, you know, reps. I think it's really encouraging to see more people who are stepping forward to become reps as well, though, by the way. But I think that there's a real issue here, because the union movement is going to lose membership, but it's going to gain membership, and we need to dictate what that new membership looks like and what it does, because while, you know, we're out of power in government for another few years at least, we've still got power in the workplace, but only if we use it.
Awesome. Thank you, Shelly. So we've got a few other questions, but they're pretty much stepping on the same sort of issues as others. So I'll just end with, we've got a few people who have been on the call and others who will be watching this back. The next sort of, I imagine, 12 months for trade unions, the workforce, people, working class people, is going to be really, really important. What can our members do, and what can LMN do to support TUC and other trade unions? What can we do to help the movement? Because as you've highlighted today, and as I think is not said often enough, the Labour Party, and therefore the Labour Muslim Network, is the political wing of the trade union movement. It's the representation of the trade union movement in Parliament, at local parties and things like that. So what can we do, and what can our members do to better support the trade union movement, of which I see us as a part of that movement?
Great question. I'm just going to quickly go back to the councillors one, because something just popped into my head again, and this is, you know, regardless of whether you're a councillor or not. The TUC has recently launched a join a union drive, and it's piloted with Islington Council, and they have paid for, well, I don't think they've really paid, because they've got access to kind of outdoor advertising spaces, you know, on bus stops and electronic billboards and things like that, where they've put up a message that we've designed which says "Stay safe at work, join a union," and then it's got like a number that you can text in, and it will send you back advice on what union you should join. That's something we're trying to get councils across the country to do. So if you're a councillor, please get in touch with me and find out how you might be able to do that as well. And if you're not, please lobby your councillor to do the same thing, because I think it'd be brilliant. It's something the government obviously isn't going to do. It would be brilliant if we could have these kind of posters up on streets around the country, encouraging people to join a union and emphasising why it's so important. In terms of other things that Labour members can do, I'm actually going to post a link in the chat of something I wrote a couple of years ago now, but just with some ideas of things that I think are really practical things that Labour Party members can do, ranging from, like, as I said, again, similar advice to the councillors really, but like going along to a picket line if there's something happening in your area, and like being that kind of visible boost to the people that are taking that action. Taking motions to your CLP meetings, inviting somebody from a union to come and speak at your meetings, using your Labour Party meetings as a way of fundraising for a strike fund. There are a lot of things people can do, and like I said before as well, one of the things that really gets to me is how little we talk about the stuff that's happening in trade unions. As a Labour Party, we talk a lot about the Labour Party and what is going on in the Labour Party, and we barely even really pay lip service to trade unions. I think we don't really talk about what is going on in the workplaces. We talk about that relationship of so-and-so supporting so-and-so for leader, but you know, how many strikes are happening at the moment in Labour affiliated union workplaces? How many have happened within the last year? And like people, I think people need to be sharing things on social media, talking to each other about it, and again, like offering that kind of practical solidarity and visibility to the people who really, really need it. it's not a lot. It's I think it's easy work. The hard stuff is that kind of work of finding the union members and really politicizing them and bringing them into our cause as socialists.
Amazing. Thank you, Shelly. I'm just going to repost that because otherwise I don't know if everyone will get it into the...
It says to everyone, so hopefully.
Okay, brilliant. All right. Big thank you to Shelly. Thank you everyone for joining us and for putting your different questions and comments into the chats. This will be recorded and it'll go on our the section of our website where everybody can watch it back and hopefully can learn like we have retrospectively as well. So once again, a big thank you to Shelly Asquith for joining us from the TUC. If you're interested, we have a couple of events coming up that you can join as well. So next week, I believe on Wednesday, we have the event around COVID disproportionately affecting Muslim and BAME communities. That will be done with the Muslim Doctors Association. And then the week following, we have another webinar just like this, where it'll be we will be talking about campaigning online. So one of the digital organizers from the Labour Party during the general election will go through how best to campaign online. So once again, thank you so much, Shelly, for joining us and for sharing your expertise and an amazing webinar. This is the first of many, so do make sure you keep an eye on the website. Thank you again, everyone, and specifically to Shelly. See you guys next time.
Thanks all, solidarity comrades.